Hello everyone, I'd like to welcome you all to the Chartered Institute of Linguists webinar, Translation for Museums, How to Translate Object Descriptions for Art, Historical and Cultural Museums, presented by Michelle Deeter. My name is Sahela Phillips and I'm the Events and Networks Manager. During this webinar, you can ask questions by posting them on the questions panel to the right of your screen, and at the end of the presentation, the Q&A session will follow. Just a reminder, all attendees will receive a certificate and a link to the recording within 2 working days. And those of you who are CIOL members, you can log this webinar on My CPD. But for now, I'd like to welcome our speaker. Hi, Michelle.
Hi there.
Hello there. I'm going to pass controls over to you now so we can begin, and I'll confirm that we can see your slides.
Great. Does that work?
It should be coming up now. Yes, we can see them.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Okay, so as Sahela just mentioned, my name is Michelle Deeter. I am a translator and interpreter and also a lecturer of translation. My working languages are Chinese and English, but in order to make this more practical for more of you, I have a few examples in German and a few examples in Spanish. I hope that you find this talk very practical and informative. So just as an overview of what we'll be talking about today, I will start with an introduction to museum studies. Then I will give you 5 broad principles for translation, kind of tips for working on a particular project. And interspersed with that, I will give you examples of those principles of translation. And then finally, at the end, we'll do a question and answer. So first, let's go for some definitions. What is a museum? According to the Museums Association, they are institutions that collect, safeguard, and make accessible artifacts and specimens which they hold in trust for society. Or if we want a definition from an American, a museum in its simplest form consists of a building to house collections of objects for inspection, study, and enjoyment. We can categorize museums according to what kind of collections they hold. So for instance, art museums, history museums, natural history museums, where you would see dinosaur skeletons, for instance, museums of science and technology, and botanical gardens and zoos. Our main focus here will be art museums and history museums, although I have done some translation for botanical gardens before as well. We could also categorize museums according to what organization runs them. So government museums, municipal museums, university museums, army museums, private museums, and commercial company museums. Different museums do have different purposes, so they could be focused on conservation, or they could be focused on research, or exhibition, or education. I think a lot of the time we think that all museums only focus on exhibition and education, and some people think that should be their main focus, but usually it's a little bit of all 4. So in a book I read, apparently most museums use about 30% of their buildings for public display, 30% for study or reserve collections, and 40% for office space, educational purposes, and visitor services. So that's a bit of a mix. But there are definitely museums in the UK that are strictly focused on research, and they're maybe not open to the public except by appointment. There's just a lot of different types out there. Museums have a lot of benefits for the community where they're located. The most obvious one, perhaps, is that they provide cultural and educational benefits to the community. This is pretty self-explanatory. So the photo I have here is from a Paul Smith exhibition, which is showing some fashion and art. So this particular benefit can preserve and conserve the community's cultural and natural heritage. It also offers a space for events so the community can hold events. And it can also enhance the quality of people's lives. All good things. Museums can also provide economic benefits. This is a photograph of Mass MoCA, which is a contemporary art museum based in Massachusetts in the United States. In the past, everyone in that town in Massachusetts worked at the local mill, but then manufacturing moved overseas and all the jobs disappeared. When they converted the mill buildings into a museum, this community was able to bring jobs back into the town and also increase tourism. So the museum had a really big and positive effect on the community. Museums can also provide corporate or political benefits. And what I mean by that is, for example, if a local government has responsibility for the museum, that museum can maybe foster a sense of community or belonging, maybe some local pride. And if there's values of that community, the museum can maintain those values. The museum could also demonstrate change and continuity within the local area and allow people to explore their community's roots. So the photo I have here is of the cotton gin at the Museum of Science and Industry in Manchester. I now live in Manchester, and so this is now my home, and I enjoy going to this museum to understand more about where Manchester is coming from, but also where Manchester is headed. I think it's a really interesting way to learn about where you live and where you call home. So you might be wondering, why? Why does it even matter that museums have certain benefits on a community? I'm just a translator. I think it's important to know about these benefits because if you're attempting to get grants or other money for the funding of a translation, you should be able to articulate how these museums are helpful and why this money should be used for a translation, for instance. So I have a photo here of a new timeline of protests that is in the Pankhurst Trust in Manchester. It's a really cool timeline. It's a huge poster. It's got a lot of information on it. But there's 3 different organizations that helped make it possible. Remembering Resistance is a research project. Imagination Lancaster is another research project. And Heritage Fund, you might recognize, is a public body that distributes a share of national lottery funding, supporting a wide range of heritage projects across the United Kingdom. So basically, if you want to convince the Heritage Fund that there should be a translation available for this museum, you should be able to explain why that will benefit the community. And that's why I bring it up. This is a list of the most visited museums in the UK, according to ALVA, which is an industry body. Number 1 is Windsor Great Park, so Windsor Castle. Number 2 is Kew Gardens. Number 3 is Chester Zoo. Number 4 is the Natural History Museum. Number 5 is the Royal Horticultural Society Garden, Wisley. Number 6 is the British Museum. Number 7 is Tate Modern. Number 8 is Somerset House. Number 9 is the Science Museum, London. Number 10 is V&A, South Kensington. The reason why I bring up this slide is if you are translating into English, you can probably check the websites of one of these top 10 museums to see how the biggest museums with the biggest budgets would describe a similar object. In the past, I've definitely used the British Museum a lot. I've used RHS Garden Wisley for the botanical and Kew Gardens for the botanical translation I did, and also V&A South Kensington. If it happens to match with the particular area that you're translating in, it's a really good resource. So again, more introduction into museum studies. What is an object? It's an item of interest in a museum. This can apply to cultural objects, items from the biological world, and artifacts. Our focus today is on paintings, sculptures, art, and other cultural objects. Most museums have rules about when they acquire objects and dispose of objects, but we won't be covering that very much today. So what is a cultural object? They're objects of importance for archaeology, history, literature, or art, and they belong to one of the following: rare species of fauna, flora, minerals, and anatomy, property relating to history, products of archaeological excavations, elements of artistic or historical monuments or archaeological sites, antiquities, as long as they're more than 100 years old, including inscriptions, coins, and engraved seals, objects of ethnological interest or artistic interest, archives, including sound, photographic, and film archives, and articles of furniture or instruments more than 100 years old. So let's get into displays at this point. A display is a glass or plastic case that allows visitors to view the object. The display might protect the object. For instance, it could protect it from fluctuations in humidity and temperature, or protect it from atmospheric pollution such as salt crystals if the museum is located close to the sea. And it could also include information to explain the context of the object. So this is an example case of a museum in London. It's showing a Bow Street uniform. That's what the police used to look like when they were first kind of organized in London. What is a label? It's just a basic means by which the museum transforms a collection of objects into a storytelling exhibition. The museum staff probably know, but we should also know that labels should attract attention, convey information in a concise way, and motivate the visitor to look at the whole exhibition by awakening curiosity. We have 3 different types of label. The main label, also called the room label, states the theme. The case label will describe the sub-themes. It's not going to be as prominent as the main label though. And the caption labels are located near most individual objects. Caption labels will provide facts such as the name of the object, the maker, the date, and the place of origin. That's what I did the most translation of, was caption labels. So let's look at some examples of these types. This is a photo of a case label. So we can see there's 3 objects in this case, and generally the case label is describing patrolling in the Covent Garden, again, when the police were first formed in London. Here we can see both caption labels and a translated main label. So the caption labels are on the wall, and the main label and also some captions are translated onto a piece of paper in English. This museum is in Brussels, so it's not going to put everything in English all over the place. And also you're going to need a lot of different languages. So what this museum decided to do was to translate everything into multiple languages and provide that on laminated pieces of paper so that whoever wanted to read a particular part of the museum or understand more about the objects they were looking at could read it in the language that they would like. Here we've got a main label or a room label with an exhibit that has 3 cases. This is an exhibit at Philip Robinson Library in Newcastle University, so it's a quite small exhibit and it's not really a full-on museum, but you can see how large it is, right? This is almost as tall as I am, probably a little taller, let's be honest. And it's giving you that big picture, a theme, and telling you the story that you're supposed to be grasping from looking at these objects. What is an exhibit? It's a showing or display of materials for the purpose of communication with an audience. Of course, museums have permanent and temporary exhibits. Permanent ones might be more likely to have a translation, whereas temporary ones, there might not be enough time or enough resources to get them translated. Exhibits may have objects from storage or on loan. It just depends. And the exhibit has a few main components: a storyline, objects, and an area that uses various exhibit methods. Museums aren't perfect, so I just thought I would discuss that briefly if we can. So one of the main problems of museums is that history is interested in the objects of everyday life, but they can be difficult to obtain. Usually beautiful and unusual objects survive, whereas everyday objects do not survive over the long term. So we have 2 examples here. On the left, we have a costume from a Harry Potter film at Harry Potter World. And on the right, we have a recreation of a prison matron's dress in Lincoln Castle. So just as a teeny bit of background, the matron was responsible for the welfare of female prisoners, as well as overseeing the prison laundry and food for the prisoners. It was a pretty important job, usually held by an unmarried woman who would have lived in the female wing of the prisoner. And she probably didn't have a uniform, but dressed in a sober, sensible fashion, like the dress that we're seeing in this photo. But what I find really interesting is Lincoln Castle did not have a surviving dress, did not have a surviving example, or even a photograph. They had to borrow a photograph from Brixton Prison and then recreate a dress that would be probably what it looked like in the time. That was the best that they could do. Another, perhaps more important problem of museums is that museums tend to attract a certain audience, not everybody in the community. Some people only visit museums while they're in school, so part of a field trip, kind of forced to go, and then they don't visit once they're finished with their schooling. As an example, this is me at the Bolton Museum. They had an exhibit about the LGBTQ community in the United Kingdom. I am not LGBTQ. I am a cis white female. I earn pretty well and I have a higher education level. So I fit a very specific demographic of people who tend to go to museums. And maybe that's not a big deal, but some people argue that museums don't try hard enough to attract other audiences. And again, when it gets down to funding, you could argue that the government shouldn't spend resources on a museum if it's not attracting everybody in the community. Museums can be improved in many ways. Most of these are maybe targeted towards museum staff, but still it's worth knowing. We want to make the exhibit captivating. We want to target a specific audience. We want to make the exhibit easy to navigate and access. We should consider electronic interactive aspects, especially post-COVID. And we want to create an environment as if designing a set in a theater. Most important to us as translators, we want to avoid information overload. This is tricky. It's possible to add context for visitors even in a monolingual English situation. So these two photos are from a Chinese art exhibit in the New York area. It included an explanation of real animals in Chinese art and then mythical animals in Chinese art. So as an example, I described bats, and since bats are called fu in Chinese, that rhymes with the word for good fortune, and that's why bats are a symbol of good luck in Chinese culture. I think that's really cool. I think the curious visitor would love to learn these kinds of details, so it shows that this New York museum has a very good understanding of their audience, of their typical visitor, and is giving them something really exciting and fun to learn. So it is possible to do that in other museums too, and in a cross-cultural context, perhaps in a multilingual context as well. So let's dive into our tips, shall we? The first thing you should definitely do is communicate with the client. Try to ask your questions as early as possible. Things you may want to ask are, where are the pictures? Please, can I have the images? Because it is so hard to translate if you've never seen that object before and you don't know what's going on. It's also a good idea to ask if the exhibit will be online or in person. If it's online, you might have more space. If it's in person, the label might really have some kind of limitations in terms of how many words can fit on it. So it's good to know. And a related question, what is the final format of the document? You know, is it Word? Is it Excel? Is it online, HTML? And again, related, does the text have space restrictions? In the past, I have not worked with any space restrictions. I've been very lucky, but you know, it could be a situation almost like subtitling where there's only so much that you can write, otherwise it doesn't look very good. And nitty-gritty, as soon as you can, try to ask those questions like this phrase could be translated as A or B. Which do you prefer? Because it's culture, so there are some things where there might not be a perfect right answer, and probably the client will have a suggestion for you. If you can ask the question soon enough, then you can still deliver that project on time. As some example, client expectations, I have heard clients say our audience is global and culturally aware, but not necessarily art experts. So that helps me figure out how much I should explain to the reader. The tone is medium formality, so maybe we avoid the word hence, but we're not going to say wanna and gonna, of course. Most clients have told me to avoid references to we, our, and us in reference to the source language country. So what I mean by that is instead of saying our country's culinary history, we should say Spain's culinary history. That's clearer and will make sense to more target readers. I've also seen the suggestion that for languages that do not use the Latin alphabet, the source language term should never be included unless the word or symbol described in the text is directly visible in an accompanying image. For example, a Chinese symbol that's embroidered on a piece of clothing. So this matters for me. I work in Chinese. I don't want to include any Chinese characters in the translation, that's what the client has asked me to do. Okay. Tip number 2, use your glosses wisely. There can be terms that are unfamiliar to the readers, which could affect their understanding and enjoyment of the object. So if you think that this is an unfamiliar term and it's possible to use a gloss, do so. At the same time, readers of museum texts tend to be educated. They might even know a little bit of the source language and the target language, so you don't want to give them so much information that they're either bored or they feel patronized. Definitely use a gloss rather than a footnote. If it's going to be online, a footnote could be awkward. If it's going to be on a label, it's going to be equally awkward, so footnote is just not an option. 2-word glosses are the ideal if you can manage it. So here's an example. David holds a carefully sculpted rote. I have no idea what a rote is. So let's add the gloss. David holds a carefully sculpted rote, stringed instrument. Super short, suddenly easy to understand. That is what we're aiming for. Another example. After the grapes are crushed, the must is fermented to produce wine. We can just give a little more information there, and this time we'll put the term after instead of the term first. After the grapes are crushed, the juice, or must, is fermented to produce wine. So both of those ways are absolutely fine. The key here is that we're not distracting the reader too much. We're keeping it short. Short is really the most important thing. We don't want information overload. You might think of other ways to include this kind of clarification. Just make sure it doesn't make the sentence and the whole text clunky. Avoiding anything more than a few words is our goal because we don't want to make the target reader totally lost. You might find that it's a cultural thing that is so rare or it's from long ago in history that they will be totally lost. You need more. As a translator, you have to kind of make that decision. You have to know when you need more information and when just 2 words is going to be okay. So about finding that balance, do avoid adding detail where it might make the reader feel patronized. As a super obvious example, we're not going to say Paris and then the capital of France, because we can assume that most visitors know that. So here's an example of an actual text that I translated. We'll just focus on the highlighted part. Zun in Chinese is just not described at all, even though it's a very old vessel. We write the clay zun and then ritual vessel in parentheses or brackets afterwards. And one more little point here, zun I would normally put in italics because it's borrowed from a foreign language. However, the client asked me not to use italics in the text, so that's how we did it. As another example, this is a carving of an official and he's wearing a futou. Again, because this is from a long time ago and Chinese officials no longer wear this kind of headgear, I felt like it was necessary to add a little bit more information. Futou, a hat worn by officials in ancient China. I wish I could have gotten it shorter, but I felt like this was as good as I could do. But you can see, right, the Chinese looks very short and concise. The English is much longer. This is an example in German that I actually saw quite recently, where I think actually the translator could have included a gloss. So on the left, we have Landgraf a few times, and on the right, we have Landgrave 3 times. That is the correct term. That is the technical term. And it just means a count having jurisdiction over a territory and having under him several inferior counts. Great. I don't know German history that well, so I had never encountered the word. Good news though, it is on Wikipedia, so a curious person who had access to the internet could double check that pretty quickly. Still, I find that this is a culture specific item and it might have been nice to use a gloss in the first instance. So maybe not the first arrow because that's still a subheading, but definitely the first instance in the body text, which is the second arrow down. That's just my opinion though. At the end of the day, your client may have certain requirements, or you may find, no, this works here. We don't need this here. It really depends on the context. Tip number 3 is pay attention to punctuation. You probably already do this in your other translations, so I apologize if I'm telling you something very obvious. But because these labels are going to be read a whole bunch of times, especially if it's a physical label, it's printed once and it stays there for 10 years, you want to get it right. You want to be detail-oriented. Be aware that punctuation rarely carries over directly, and some punctuation should never be used in English, such as the tilde. It kind of looks like a squiggly hyphen, so that's the thing I mean there. It is used to indicate range in Chinese and also in Japanese, but it doesn't mean that in English. So as soon as you see that symbol in a Chinese text, you should know, oh, wait. We definitely need to trade that with a straight hyphen, just a regular hyphen. Related, we should be really aware of sentence length. The reader should be able to grasp the meaning the first time they read the sentence. You can move the sentence, you can move the text from one sentence to another, or even from one paragraph to another. And I think all of you will have a good sense for this, but it can happen that when you're really working hard on a translation, you've read that same text again and again and again, so you know what you mean by the 5th time you've read the text. It's important to do that quality check at the end and make sure that the reader who only looks at this text once, who doesn't have all the background that you have after researching, is still able to grasp that meaning instantly. And I apologize if it's obvious, but definitely don't be afraid to use one word in English that does the same job as 5 in the source. If you're translating from another language into English, that's just a good thing to keep in mind. Some of you might be wondering if we should use quotation marks for foreign words. Some of you might be screaming at your computers right now, no, of course not. Well, you're right. You should not use quotation marks for foreign words. Here's an example. It is a local dish made from chayote. That's kind of unclear, and it suggests that chayote is either ironic or said by someone. So we should just put, it is a local dish made from a fruit called chayote. Okay, that's better. For a Chinese example, in the Song dynasty, wine vessel seals were called 九封 or 泥头封 in Chinese. We don't need those quotation marks. We can just write, in the Song dynasty, wine vessel seals were called 九封 or 泥头封 in Chinese. All done. Brackets are okay, but I would avoid using brackets in the header or like the title of the object. If there is a foreign term included in the header, make sure it is explained or defined in the first or second sentence that follows. As always, be brief. Let's look at an example of that so you know what I'm saying. Okay, we have this tiny ball here, and it's called a Chuiwan ball. Chuiwan is in the title, but we're not going to explain it because it just makes the title look really ugly. Basically, that's why you do that. So we put it in the first sentence. Chuiwan, striking a ball with a stick, was the ancient Chinese equivalent of golf, according to one treatise, Wanjin Jishu. Right, so you've got 2 instances of brackets happening here. That's absolutely fine. As long as it's in the body text, it's fine. Also pay extra attention to labels. I mean, I'm sure you pay attention to all of the text you do, but a label is something that we want the visitor to be able to get immediately as soon as they read it. A good label requires good literary composition, and there's 2 translation processes happening. The first one is the detailed knowledge and the jargon of the museum staff must be transformed into an explanation using language readily understood by the non-expert. So if the museum is in China, that will be jargon Chinese transformed into Chinese that's readily understood by the visitor. And then it could be translated again from Chinese into English. Just know that visitors who must endure long labels experience museum fatigue and will skip them. This is true whether it's a physical museum or we're looking on something online. We'll just keep scrolling if it's too long and we don't really feel like we're enjoying the experience. So the biggest problem with most labels is verbosity. You can cut that down, use punctuation wisely to make it easier to read. So as an example here of, again, a text that I translated for a client, we have 2 commas in the Chinese, and we're replacing them with 2 full stops or periods in the English. I think it really makes sense here because we start talking about the incense holder as the subject, then we go to the lid, and then we go back to the object as a whole. So it just reads easier if we use full stops. Tip number 4 is to maximize your informants. Personally, I have a source language informant who helps me when I'm unsure about meaning, and a target language informant who makes sure my style is clear and fits, museum label style. My target language informant, my English language informant, works in a museum. You might have excuses for not using an informant. For instance, I have a tight deadline, try to negotiate a better deadline next time. Or you might say, I don't want to bother them, even though they're your friend or someone you know. Just distill your email into 3 questions. Most people will be able to reply then. Or maybe you're saying, I don't know anybody who knows about museums. Well, in that case, ask other CIO members in your language pair. There's probably someone who can help. This is a text that I found very difficult. This is a bronze mirror, again, because it's both old and it's something culturally that's different from the culture I grew up in. It takes a little extra work. So my source language informant told me that the first part highlighted is just saying the mirror is made using the family Huang special technique. So maybe we can just shorten that and say made by family Huang is inscripted on the bronze mirror. And another thing she picked up, 传承有序 refers to lineage that is passing down, so the family is dedicated to making bronze mirrors. So it's just really helpful to make sure that I've got a full understanding, a deep understanding of a very short and concise text. I would highly recommend both source and target language informants. My last tip is many tabs is healthy. It really helps to maximize your internet resources when you're doing this kind of translation. When I'm translating a museum text, I'll always have the British Museum, Sotheby's, Google Books, and dictionary websites open. If you can, you might want to get a copy of Oxford English Dictionary, or perhaps get access to Oxford Reference, which is easier to access if you work at a university, I'll admit, but maybe you get something specific like a furniture technical dictionary or something about paintings, a dictionary explaining those terms, because depending on your language pair, you might not need all the dictionaries that Oxford makes, but there's certain ones that would be really useful to you. It sounds very old school to buy books, but it can be very helpful if you have the right book on your shelf. Also, I'd recommend using the museum's own social media. I had 1 or 2 cases where the client just didn't want to give me images of the objects, and I had to translate based on the text only. But I realized that if I searched the names of the objects online and the museum name, I was able to bring up those objects really quickly. So it wasn't too big of a deal once I figured that out. So this is an example of a Chinese museum based in Shanghai, Xintiandi, and it's talking about the Shikumen building, which is a particular type of architecture that existed in a particular time in China. So I do this text with my students at Newcastle, and we show kind of each room in the Shikumen house, also known as an alleyway house, and we show how we can research to get all the words right, even if we're not able to go to Shanghai. So the first room that we'll look at today is the living room. There's 3 things I want to mention here. 1, qianlou is a really strange word. We can say living room if we're translating into US English. We might say sitting room if we're translating into UK English. Just ask your client. Second thing we have is 立地门, which literally means standing ground door. It's just a really big door that goes pretty much from the ceiling to the floor. I think large doors works better here. We don't need to find a special term. We don't need to suddenly use Chinese. Large doors. We can keep going. Tianjin, on the other hand, is kind of an architectural special thing, and according to Google Books, a lot of other experts in this field will use the pinyin. So we did use the pinyin in this case. This is a picture of the study in this Shikumen Museum in Shanghai. Looks pretty cool. They've got the flowers up. This is just showing how it would have looked like in a typical family home at this time. So again, we've got Qian coming up for front room. front bedroom. Yanghang is probably just foreign company. We don't necessarily have to say Western. We don't have to spend a lot of time on that word. And then we have Maobi and Xuanchi. In Chinese, it's not clear if it's singular or plural, but fortunately, when we find the picture, we can see there's multiple brushes and there's plenty of paper. So great, let's go for plural. Calligraphy paper I found was the easiest way to say it. You could definitely write the pinyin Xuanzhi, but it's hard to pronounce Xuanzhi. So why not just write calligraphy paper? And now we have a German to English example. This is taken from a museum in northwestern Germany about a particular artist. Okay, and so I had a colleague help me check what they would have changed from the original museum's translation. And my colleague recommended 3 things. First, we have this historical mixture of styles would be a lot clearer than just putting historicist eclecticism. So basically, she's using the gloss, but she's putting the layman's explanation or the easy to understand part first, and then in brackets, she's putting the technical term, historicist eclecticism. In the original, we only have, in the original German, we don't have this explanation, but it might be useful for our target readers, so that's what my colleague recommends. The second thing we've changed is the Wilhelminische Ära was translated the first time around as Wilhelmina period with an A instead of an E. So that's just being more careful and checking more often, or perhaps the failure of getting a target text informant to double check your work. Then you might catch an error like that. And this is an addition. The colleague of mine thought it would be a good idea to just explain a little bit more about this eclecticism that's going for an extravagant look without looking too modern. Okay, this is another German English example that I saw in Sankor, also in Germany. So this is just posted onto the wall. Anybody who can read German or English can walk by and check it out. It's a pretty decent translation, but there are a few things that I would change. First of all, it's a pretty long text, so I apologize if you can't see everything on the screen. First thing I would say is restructuring is something that we could think about. Because of the narrowness in the Oberstrasse, I don't think it's necessary to use nominalization, narrowness. In our first sentence here, it sounds really technical. If we could get it a little bit shorter or say something that's a little bit more everyday language, that would be better. Second, props to the translator for translating Oberstrasse as upper street. Some readers might not know that that's what it means. I think it's a good addition. Third, we normally call it the 30 Years' War, so plural after year, plural S. I have seen it as 30 years, Y-E-A-R-S apostrophe. I have also seen it without the apostrophe, but the way it's written here is just wrong, guys. It needs to be 30 Years' War. And then finally, paving stones. I have no idea why they decided a hyphen was needed. Usually we would put a hyphen there if we're trying to indicate an adjective, but that should be a noun. So little stuff where, you just hope the translator could get somebody else to double check the work. But it's not a terrible job either. Just highlighting examples for you. So hopefully you know how to put these tips into practice. If you're interested in learning more about museums, I have some resources for you. You can learn about the history of museums in a fun animated video. That might be more fun than reading a textbook. And probably my biggest recommendation is to search the British Museum collection, which is available online. You can search for specific terms like ruyi, which is a certain ceramic painting style, or jingdezhen, which is also a ceramic style. Those are related to me, but I'm sure if you have other cultural things that you need to look up, British Museum is likely going to have some objects and some descriptions that can help you check if you're saying things the right way. Other museums do have great online collections. They're just not as comprehensive as the British Museum. That's what I've found. We know it's a top 10 museum, so that makes sense that they have a bigger budget and they have a bigger website. Also, the Collections Trust has a whole range of resources, so you can look at a link for their terminology page or search around on that website, or also go to YouTube. There's some resources there as well. The Objectivity YouTube channel is super fun. There's one about cleaning a mummy that I just found totally fascinating, even though mummies are not a thing in Chinese culture. And also there's a lot of interviews with Keith, who works at the Royal Society. He's the like museum director of the Royal Society. And so it's really cool how it talks about incoming objects, if that's something you're interested in. Google Cultural Institute has a lot of museums from all around the world and all their collections or some of their collections online. And so if that museum is based in Spain or in Poland or in Egypt, you know, they're going to usually translate that into English. I've done work for them before. The translations are not all perfect, but that's life, I guess. It's a really cool website, though. It's just amazing how much is on there. There's also an article that I would recommend to you, learning about the 5 types of museum visitors. You can either click that hyperlink, or if for some reason you can't access the hyperlink, go ahead and just write down that PDF, that super long URL. There's also some podcasts about museums. You know, I couldn't avoid talking about podcasts because I love podcasts. But these are the 2 that I found good enough to keep listening to again and again. One is called the Lonely Palette podcast. So that focuses on art. But she covers like painting and also sculpture and also outdoor art, like a lot of different stuff. It's really, really fun. And the other is Museum Secrets by the Ashmolean Museum. The episodes are very short and they're often given by actual museum staff. So that one is interesting because you're learning about stuff from the expert's perspective, how they work in a museum or how they think about their objects. There are a lot of museums now that have online content, and that's something to look into if you want to translate for a museum that's very, very far away from you. Right, so I could translate for a museum based in Tianjin or a museum based in Chengdu and still stay here in Manchester, no big deal, if everything's online. So some examples, there's museums in Surrey that have put all of their content online. This is really fun and great. Potentially, if you work out of English, you could ask to do it for free and then make that a CV builder, right? Just offer to translate it and then ask for a letter of reference so that you can put that as a specialism on your CV, on your profile, wherever you have your profile online. Another really interesting example is the Eastern State Penitentiary Museum in the United States. It has its entire audio guide available online. So that's in English, but then the audio guide is in multiple languages and they have those transcripts translated into multiple languages. So I just find it fascinating that they're able to offer that to so many different visitors, even if you're not able to get to that museum in person. I think that's the gold standard. If you are someone who loves to read, these 2 books can help you understand the industry as a whole. Museums in Motion: An Introduction to the History and Functions of Museums is a little bit US-centric, but I found it really good. And Museum Basics by Timothy Ambrose and Crispin Payne is kind of sponsored by UNESCO, so they try really hard to make it international. In that way, it's kind of more boring, actually. But again, it's very practical and it can help give you insights into how museums work. Once you know how they work, you can figure out how to get direct clients, I would say. So that's all from me. I'm happy to take questions now. Also, if you have questions later, you can leave a message on my website, michelledeeter.com. Or you can add me on LinkedIn. If you're on LinkedIn, please just include a note so I know that you met me from this webinar rather than in person. Thanks.
Fantastic, Michelle. Thank you so much. So yes, if anyone has questions, please could you post them now? But let's start off with, in the broadest terms, would you consider museum translation as part of literary translation, technical translation, or perhaps a combination of the 2?
Oh, that's a great question, Sahela. I love it. I would lean towards technical translation because there's going to be a lot of terms that you want to get right. or whether that's an architectural term or an artistic term. At the same time, one of my slides said making a label requires good literary composition, but I think what we mean there is good writing skills, rather than telling a beautiful story, right? The beautiful storytelling happens in the main label. It does not happen in the caption label. So it depends a little bit then on the text type. It will depend also a little bit on if this is an art museum versus a science and industry museum versus maybe a private museum. So yeah, as always, translators require a lot of skills to get their jobs done. But if I had to, if you told me you must make a decision right now, Michelle, I would say technical is the main type of translation this is.
Okay, thank you. How did you get into translation for museums? If you specialise in other fields, how often do you get jobs from museums as compared to your other areas?
So I kind of fell into museum translation by accident. A few agencies asked me if I would be willing to take on the work. I saw a sample of the text and I said, yes, count me in. I don't do it very often. There was a period where I had maybe a project a month, and for whatever reason, that period has stopped. I don't know if the client no longer needs that work or if the money ran out or what happened. I have not worked for direct clients in this field except for that botanical gardens report. So maybe the way to get back into that work is to find more direct clients and show them that I have this amazing experience of working for different agencies. So there's two things that I want to say about that answer. One is that because I work from Chinese into English, that's a pretty special language pair. Not a lot of people do it. And that's why I tend to not specialize. I ask the client to show me the text and I'll say yes or no based on how I feel and what my schedule is like. I have a no list. I don't do financial translation. I don't do traditional Chinese medicine. I don't do gaming translation, but everything else, show me the text and maybe I'll take it on. If you're doing a language pair that's more popular, let's say Spanish to English, you might not have the luxury of not specializing. So just be aware of that. My context is a little bit different. And second, how often, I mean, it really just depends on how determined you are. There are people out there who just specialize really, really specifically. And in order to do that, they probably join museum industry associations. They make more direct clients. They build these kind of relationships. And then people get to know them for that specialism and seek them out. Because I have plenty of other work and I like variety, I have not done that. But it's certainly something that you could do if you think, yes, this is where I want to go deep. This is how I want to specialize in my career.
Okay, great, thank you. For artifacts from classical China, would the Chinese prefer native bilingual translators to communicate the significance of the artifacts? And how do they quality control the meanings in the translation?
I mean, you can always have a wish list, right? So for articles from classical China, I think a lot of clients would want to have a native English speaker if they could get it, but they might not know where to find that native English speaker. Where from a practical perspective, China's payment system is completely different from all of the West. And so I often have to remind people, I can't take a WeChat payment. Like either we have to do an old school bank transfer or you have to pay me on PayPal. If you don't have PayPal, this conversation is over. So from a practical perspective, even if they wanted a native English speaker, they might not be able to get it. And still, like if there was lots of money, I'd honestly say that a co-translation would be a better option. So you have the PhD who is a native Chinese speaker and understands this almost as well as all of the museum staff, but also understands a little bit of English. And then you also have the native English speaker who has good writing skills and who can produce a label that's easy for that visitor to read. Quality control, it's really going to depend from project to project.
Right.
If it's an agency, they probably have a workflow, they have documents figuring out how to do their quality control. If it's a direct client, it's completely on you to be able to provide quality. And you might make a careless mistake or you might make an honest mistake that, it was just a really big document, you didn't catch it, but because no other pair of eyes is looking at it, that ends up getting printed. it's possible.
Sure. Okay, thank you. Specifically for Chinese, when using romanization, would you include the tone mark diacritics, or is this for the client to decide?
What a lovely question. You guys, you have such excellent questions.
Great.
I would find that from an industry perspective, or looking at other scientific articles in the area of museums, tone marks are not included. Even in a tourism context, I find that only Lonely Planet, that tour guide, will include the tone marks. Nobody else does. So if the client asked me to decide, I would say no tone marks. However, I agree with you. I would defer to the client. If they say, please use tone marks, we find that this is better, then sure, I'll add that, no problem.
Okay. So kind of two questions here. How do you approach museums, and do you find that the work tends to come from direct clients rather than agencies?
I thought this question would come up, and I have an extra slide just for you. How do I get work in this area? I knew somebody was going to ask. Okay, it really depends a lot on your language pair and on the museum. Is this a government museum? Is this a private museum, right? It depends on that client. If it's a government museum, maybe it's possible to do something direct. If it's, in some cases, the museum might only think to find an agency, and therefore you have to connect to the agency to be able to get that translation work. In the UK, at least, not many museums have the budget for translation, but that could be different in Korea, in China, in other places. So in that case, I can't give you a good answer. It really depends on your language pair. I would say you could try grants and crowdfunding if you find a museum that you're absolutely in love with and you think that this should be translated into your working languages. If you can show the museum that the money is there, we can just do an application for a grant. They might be on board. If you can show that Kickstarter is going to make this happen and there's enough people on the internet that would love to have an English version of this museum, perhaps online, perhaps physically, the museum might be on board. But post-COVID, a lot of museums, not just museums in the UK, are actually struggling. They're not getting by with the budgets that they have. So this is now a lot harder. It's really hard to find this work, and all I can say is good luck.
Okay. When you do work directly with museums, should you hire a proofreader and charge accordingly for quality control?
When I work directly with clients, I would ask the question. So in one case, we had someone who was a native English speaker and also an expert in botanical gardens, used to work at Kew, and he was my proofreader. So I knew that I didn't have to find a proofreader myself. In other cases, if the client doesn't assure me that there's a proofreader, I'm probably going to find my own. And therefore, yes, I will charge accordingly. But I mean, you might already have a policy of how you deal with that for your other translation texts. So I would say do the same and charge accordingly, charge according to what makes sense.
Okay. To what extent should you bear in mind that not all museum audiences reading the English translations will be native speakers of English? Do you automatically adjust the language level?
That can be really hard to know if the museum is unable to answer that question for you. So again, if the museum is a client, I would see what they prefer. If they know that most of their visitors are either Chinese or native English speakers, and basically, again, there's the space restrictions and other considerations. So if you can get it down to a few examples, say, should it be 2-word glosses or can I use longer glosses, things like that. So if the client knows, I would defer to the client. If the client doesn't know, I would probably just assume that this is for native English speakers, because there's only so much you can do. There's so many languages out there. I don't know that I could customize for all the other non-native English speakers that exist in the world.
Sure. Okay, thank you. Someone else has just said that they were wondering whether you can say a bit more about working collaboratively, what the main challenges in terminology or specialist knowledge required for the job.
Collaborating is awesome. That's the main thing I hope you all take away. Usually it would be on an ad hoc basis. So I've got a network of friends, or I check on, my WeChat and my WhatsApp groups and ask if anybody is interested in helping in a particular project. And then for that one-off, we figure out how we want to work together. If you're both able to access something like Google Docs, that can be a good place to keep terminology together, because that's probably the one thing that's most important to harmonize between two different versions. If you're like literally splitting the project in half, or otherwise, if I'm going to be in the driver's seat for the translation, but I'd like someone to proofread my work or to check things that I'm not sure about in the source text, I might use Google Docs and then comments, or I might just use a regular Word doc and comments. However you're comfortable with working and however your co-collaborator is comfortable with working is absolutely fine. It's just useful because, again, then you have another pair of eyes looking on it, and it can be the case with something that's culturally very different or something that's so old, it's a completely different time period, that you're missing something and you don't even realize you're missing it. So that's why it's so valuable to get another person to give you some input.
Okay, well, I think we've gone through all the questions now. So thank you so much for a detailed and interesting talk, Michelle. I'm sure our listeners have found it extremely useful.
Thanks so much for having me.
Oh,
Again, if you have questions, go ahead and just post them on my website. I'd be happy to help as best as I can.
fantastic. Well, I will close the webinar now. So I just want to say thank you to everyone who has joined us today and for your excellent questions.
Yes,
All
thanks.
right, thanks. Thank you. Bye.